the chamber presidents, the four of us, we gather every year and we start to talk about some of the topics that might be of interest to all of you. And when we look at economic development and collaboration between the communities, we really wanted to make sure that our speaker today not only had a good grasp of what's going on in the Twin Cities, but also understood how our communities fit into that bigger picture. We also wanted an expert who is willing to think outside of the box and brings international ideas and concepts to the table for consideration. We found that and more in our speaker today, David Beurle, founder and CEO of Future IQ. David is a world-renowned expert on community, regional, and organizational economic revitalization. His work extends from local and regional through to corporate and governmental levels, with a focus on future thinking and long-term planning, something that I think not only governments need to take into consideration, but businesses as well. He specializes in creating innovative future planning approaches for use in regional and organizational settings. He developed the groundbreaking Future Game, which if you have a chance to talk to David about it, it's a very interesting concept that he's developed, and it's widely used in planning as a workshop tool, and it has been very successful across the world in community, regional, industry, and corporate planning. He's an accomplished speaker, having led over 200 community visioning sessions across North America, Australia, and Europe, and he's been invited to provide numerous keynote addresses and workshop presentations across the globe. And as a matter of fact, it wasn't long ago that they returned from Windsor Castle to talk about the future of urban living. He's worked in the remotest parts of Australia through working with the highest levels of government. He spent 8 years as the right-hand man to a senior Australian cabinet minister, the Western Australian Minister for Agriculture and Fisheries. Very interesting background. David has done a lot of work in the Midwest, a lot of work in Minnesota. He's very familiar with our area, and I think you'll find his ideas very interesting. Please join me in welcoming David Beurle.
Good morning. All right, great to be with you. So you eat and enjoy, and I'll talk at you, okay? Is that how it goes? So I'm going to talk about regional cooperation, why communities should collaborate. And I want to take a slightly different tack on this than maybe what you expect. I want to just talk for just a little bit about collaboration, what that really means, but I really want to probe and put forth a proposition as to why we might need to think about collaboration different to what we currently are. Okay, so I want to put that into what's happening in the world, why collaboration might be different to what we think it is going forward. All right, so let's look at some definitions, right? So, and I noticed even in the invitation, we're talking about collaboration and cooperation, but here's sort of a working set of definitions. So at different scales, right? So we start at the top, we talk networking, that's just exchanging information. The next sort of depth of working together is coordinating, where we exchange information and we sort of alter our activities, so we coordinate our activities in some way. And you may want to think about, for B.E.E.R, where do you fit onto this continuum at the moment? You know, are you primarily networking, coordinating, or cooperating? Cooperating is where you exchange information, you alter your activities, and you share resources to achieve a common purpose. But then collaborating is the exchange of information, altering activities, sharing resources, and enhancing the capacity of the other parties to be able to fulfill some common outcome. So you might just want to think, where on that continuum do you sit? Collaboration is usually characterised by substantial time commitments, very high levels of trust, and extensive areas of common turf. And we talk a lot about collaboration, and I think mostly we don't really know what we're talking about, as in we're not really taking it seriously. And what true collaboration is. True collaboration at the level of where we are influencing each other's agenda and investment and so on. Examples of large-scale collaboration, so International Space Station, there's one with some unusual partners that collaborate for a shared purpose and are dependent on each other. The Olympic Games would be another example of a large-scale collaboration. The EU, although that might be having a few little issues, right? But they're sort of examples of large-scale collaboration. Perceived benefits of collaboration. So Laurie talked about the work that we do. We have about 5,000 survey points where we've asked people, primarily in community planning processes across America, how important is it to have a shared vision? And over 85% of those people say that it's very or critically important. So at the very high end of a scale. So what do you have to have a shared vision? How do you implement that? Obviously, you have to start to think about collaborating. But also in the planning work that we do, collaboration often comes up as a very explicit intention that people have to achieve a preferred outcome. But there are some challenges to collaboration. So if it's all this important, right? If people know it's important, we want to have a shared vision, we explicitly call out collaboration as a behaviour going forward, why don't we? Why does it seem to be difficult, right? Well, let's talk about game theory for a second, right? So who's heard of the prisoner's dilemma in game theory? Okay, a few people have, right? It's this concept, so you've got prisoner B at the top there, prisoner A on the left-hand side. Both have committed some sort of a crime, right? They're being held and they're being interrogated and they have choices, right? So here's the different outcomes. Well, they might have an agreement to remain mute, right? Think of the mafia at its best, right? Will remain silent, okay? If they both remain silent, they're probably going to get 1 year in jail each. If one fesses up and the other doesn't, then they're going to get 20 years for one and 0 for the other. But if they both confess, they're going to get 5 years each. So there's this very real cost of what you do. And there's this kind of game that plays out when we talk about collaborating, which is, you can track it in game theory, about I'm making a bet on something, you know, are you going to reciprocate or am I going to be the one left with the short end of the straw? So I think that's part of the challenge when we think about collaboration. But really, why would we collaborate? And I think for this part of the world, to bring it very local to you as B.E.E.R, the 4 regions here, heft is what I would say. My argument to you, my proposition, is the compelling case for collaboration is all about heft. And we know what heft means, right? The ability to be able to influence, that you have some substance or gravitas. And I want to explain to you why I believe having heft is going to be critically important and interesting for you going forward. But I want to do that in a way where we're going to explore the future. So I want to explore the future. We want to ask some hard questions about how well positioned you are for the future. Think creatively. My intention is that the outcome of today will be perhaps a new view of the future and consideration of the scale of collaboration required for the future. So looking to the future, what scale and what type of collaboration do you really need to be able to be successful and get your jobs done in the future? And I want to draw from, as Laurie mentioned, we do quite a lot of foresight research, including the future of urban living most recently, but the future of Midwest agriculture and next industrial revolution. I want to draw from some of this because I want to paint a future canvas. That's what I'm going to do while you're digesting, right? I want to paint a future canvas of what are forces that are shaping the world and what does that mean for this particular location? Because that's what you should be using to guide how you think about collaborating, why, at what scale and for what purpose. So let's look at some of these macro trends. I'm going to talk about demographics, population, mass urbanisation. I'm going to talk about energy, food, water, changing climate, technology, next industrial revolution. And these, I think, are the buckets of trends that I've picked out that are most critical to you in this part of the world. Demographics, population, mass urbanisation. Let's start with this chart, right? So this is global population. And it runs from 1950 to 2050. I'm going to try and use as many data points as I can that cover the span of 1950 to 2050. Why is that? Well, if I look around this room, a bunch of us were born down close to 1950. Hopefully we'll all make it through to 2050. But your organisations were fundamentally designed in a world that was a 1950s world. So when you think about chambers of commerce and those type of organisations, that was the world that they were designed in, but the world's changing. My argument is, what do you need to design that sets you up for the future? Okay, because that's the basis of the discussion. And right now we're sort of midst of this. We're sort of halfway through this transition, or a little bit more than halfway. But when down in 1950, we're talking 3 billion people on the planet. We're going to head towards 9 billion before it sort of stabilises. We're about 7 now. The big issue is that the population's increase is mostly occurring in the developing countries. This is what that looks like. So on the left is the population pyramids in 4-year strips. So the bands going across are 4-year age increments, 0 to 4, 4 to 8 and so on. Left-hand side, developed countries, right-hand side, developing countries. What do you reckon the really big deal about that chart is? Well, in the developed countries, we're doing a really good job, a really poor job at reproducing, right? In the developing countries, that massive cohort of young people coming through is what's going to shape our future world, all right? Now, what you want to keep doing as I go through this is think about, what does this mean for here? What does this mean for B.E.E.R? And what you do. I'm going to try and draw some dots, right? Here's the rate of change in the world. So the red is the regions where we're seeing the most rapid percentage change in projected population. So, 150 to 300% increased population between 2004 and 2050. You can see that's smack in the middle of sort of Africa and parts of the Indian subcontinent and Asia. Our developed countries, the population's ageing. The bottom there, this is 2010 to 2050. This is the United States, 37 to 41 years of age, so an ageing population. Mexico, fascinatingly, goes from 26 to 42 in the same period. So in our developed countries, the populations are ageing. But something else is also, at a macro level, is a very significant change, which is where people live. And so the blue line is the people who live in rural populations or rural locations. The green line is people who live in urban environments. And you can see that we've just passed the point in history where there are now more people living in urban locations than in rural areas. So we have this translocation of people into these urban city environments. And that's going to accelerate. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, let's have a look at this, right? So this is a map of the world, and you can see on the left-hand side here, these dots sort of paint out North America, South America, Europe and Asia and so on. The size of the dot represents the numbers. So this is the number of people in urban populations, defined as over 100,000 people as an urban population in 1950. So remember, this is the start of that curve through to 2050, and I want to show you data points going through. And what this, I think, will reveal is this epic transformation that's occurring in humanity. So at that point in 1950, the US was 64% urban, and there was 100 million people living in urban centres, right? And the colour coding there is the purple is where it's greater than 75%, so that was Britain, Belgium, Australia, interestingly. Uruguay were the only countries that had over 75% urban population in 1950. Let's go to 2010, right? Let me just toggle back. Okay, 1950, that's when a lot of our headsets were formed. 2010, close to today. Massive expansion in urban populations around the world. The United States now has 255 million people living in cities, 82% urban. So it's a rapid shift to a urban location. Now let's look forward to 2050. Right, let me just toggle back through this. 1950, that's when chambers of commerce were formed. That's the world that they were designed for. 2010, 2050. So we have this massive explosion of urban populations where society is concentrating in mega cities and all that goes with that. The United States, we're going to add 100 million people to cities in the US between now and 2050. What do you think the implications of that might be, right? All right, so, well, as Bill Gates said in his January newsletter, he talks about that's the equivalent of building an entire New York City every month between now and 2060. This is also, when you think about where power and wealth's accumulating, this is a chart that looks at middle-class consumer spending, right? So middle-class spending power is a very good approximation of purchasing power and how people behave. So when people move into middle class, typically they've got discretionary income. So their dietary purchases change, they start buying stuff, they start to travel, and so on. So in terms of, it's not a measure of total wealth, it's just a measure of middle class spending power. But that's what drives a consumer society. The chart, the pie diagram is color-coded to a map of the world. So you can see orange is Asia Pacific. The light blue on the left-hand side is North America. The two rings of the pie chart are the transition from 2009 to 2030. So we're in the midst of that change, right? So this is middle class spending power in US trillions of dollars. What jumps out at you about that one? Yeah, North America, middle class spending power. We know that story. That's well debated here, right? It's not moving much, right? But that's not what's the game changer. The game changer is the growth in Asia Pacific. You know, almost a 600% increase in middle class spending power in a 21-year period, to the point where it now dwarfs the rest of the other major economic zones in the world. If you want to think about what's all this fuss about tariffs, I would look no further than there. That is a tapping the brake on, right? That's what that's about. It's saying that rate of growth, we don't want to get left behind, and you can see that obviously, you know, how it correlates to different parts of the world. All right, so moving closer to home here. So we know that the US was the Midwest particularly, it was built on these different sort of economic waves. So there was the agricultural economy that, you know, settled through most of the Midwest. That followed by an industrial economy, particularly post-Second World War. Manufacturing capacity in the US and Europe was, in Japan and Europe was largely destroyed. So the US went to town on that. But we are now firmly in a knowledge and experience economy. Let's look at how US society is redistributing. So this is 1980 to now. The line at the bottom is the population in numbers, in absolute numbers, in rural areas and small towns. You can see that's flatlining. And the population in the small metros, suburbs and large metros is all increasing. The issue, I think, for the Midwest, right, if you take it on a broader scale, is that rural population, that's probably the same people there. And they're going to die at some point. So there's a demographic cliff coming. Now, what does that mean for here? That's what we want to draw the dots on, right? Well, a couple more pieces, right? So we're in this, in the US, this is the age pyramid for the US. So we have these two big cohorts that we always talk about here, which is the baby boomer, the big shoulder at the top here, and then we have the millennials coming through here. And we go, okay, that's all fine. We'll survive that. We know baby boomers are seeking active lifestyles, more interaction, you know, your city planning, you deal with that all the time. How do you create these walkable, livable neighbourhoods? But there's also something else that I don't think we think enough about, which is changing societal values. So blow on her face and she'll follow you anywhere. Or how soon should baby start drinking cola? Now you chuckle, right? You think that's funny. That was advertising that was in magazines when we were around as young people, right? And so my point about societal values, so if we're thinking about the sort of role that your organisations have and how you operate together, when you look forward, think that there are rapid shifts that can occur in societal values, just like this. I mean, this was considered, you know, fantastic advertising at one point. Now we just think it's ridiculous. And I don't think blow on her face and she'll follow you anywhere is going to fly anywhere. But what are the societal values that the millennial cohort may bring that may be as sudden or that we're not ready for? You know, and think of it in terms of all sorts of different levels about how they want to operate and live. And societal change is not steady. It occurs in these sort of, you know, look at Me Too, the Me Too movement. You know, a massive reconfiguration of perspective that occurred in essentially, you know, a 12-month period. All right, so thinking about how society is redistributing, right? So we've talked a bit about how some of the macro scale coming down to a local level. So here's my working thesis, right? So as Laurie said in the introduction, we've done a lot of work through the Midwest. We've worked in, you know, even with the community of the city of Edina on visioning and planning. Waseca, Wayzata, and so on. And we've worked, currently working in Mitchell, South Dakota, right? So thinking about these different arcs out from these metropolises. So let's take the Twin Cities, because it is clear it's one of the surviving, growing metropolises, the mega cities in the world. So you think about this concentration, this 100 million people being added to cities, a chunk of them are being added here, right? So what happens in these different arcs? And this is where I think it starts to get really close to, as you think about collaboration, what are you trying to accomplish, right? And who do you want to really collaborate with? So if you take, and I call them arcs of innovation, so you have this downtown. So we know that the downtown is going through its own transformation. There's urban living, greater density, it's all changing in terms of, there's lots and lots of innovation around the world on how cities, and particularly the dense core of cities, operate. In the suburban ring, there's similar levels of innovation and reinvention occurring. You have to go no further than Southdale Mall to see what is one of the more fascinating reinventions of suburban locations. The urbanisation of suburbs, the pressure on height variations for residential developments in a suburb like Edina. There's all that's going on in this suburban ring, and you're obviously on the inner rings, but then there's outer rings as well. Then there's this peri-urban space, which is where there's another whole different level of innovation occurring, which is where the distribution centres are going. If you go to Scott County and you see what's going on, in those sort of locations. Also in that fringe around big metropolises like Minneapolis, St. Paul, you'll see innovation in the regional centres. So Mankato's trying to position itself as the Silicon Valley of food processing. You have Rochester, clearly a outstanding medical research and application location. So there's this innovation that occurs out in this sort of peri-urban assembly, distribution, innovation. Then there's this arc out here, which is this production zone. And I grew up in something like that production zone. I personally don't think there's going to be a lot of people out there in the future. We're seeing this concentration of people into cities and regional centres. Now the question for you is, how do you collaborate? Which ring? Do you collaborate at the level of the ring, like the inner suburb? Or do you need to be thinking about the collaboration across these different arcs? Is your relationship to the peri-urban space important? Is your relationship to the downtown important? Or do you just, is the suburbs that are going through reinvention, is that where you want to, collaborate? For what outcome? Okay, so I just pose that to you, right? Because society's reconfiguring dramatically. And it's happening at an epic level in our lifetimes. So if you think about designing your collaboration and organisation for the future, thinking about, well, where do we need to have those critical connection points? All right, so demographics, population, mass urbanisation, increasing global population, people are living longer, big surge in younger cohorts globally, greater urbanisation, mega cities, changing societal values, societies reconfiguring around urban hubs. What does that mean for your collaboration? All right, so I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes at your table to chew on that one, right? So what does those trends, macro, global, down to just your own metropolis and Midwest, what do they mean for your collaboration as you look forward? Okay, so I'll give you a couple of minutes to kick that around. There's no right or wrong answer. This is an exploration, right? And then we'll have a few comments, then we'll go on to the next big bucket. Okay, so please. All right, so I have some more stuff to layer on, and then we'll have some group discussion at the end, right? So, but I want to turn and talk to energy, water, food, climate change, right? So again, a set of macro trends that, in my thesis, are ones you should watch. Okay, and I want to explain why, because I suspect this bucket of topics is going to define your future, even if you're an inner ring suburb in a metropolis like Minneapolis, St. Paul. So why is that, right? So from some of our work with the University of Minnesota, we know that the global population is going to increase by 25% by 2050, and resource consumption will increase, but it doesn't increase at just 25%. The forecasts are that energy increased demand by 50% by 2050. Why is that? Well, because a lot of these people on the planet are coming out of agrarian poverty and have aspiration for lifestyles more similar to ours and so on. So that's why it's not just a straight 25%. Fresh water increased demand by 40%, and food, an increased demand by up to 60%, and also the types of food will change as well. Energy, at present 2.5 billion people rely on burning wood and animal dung as their chief source of energy. Billion plus have no electricity of any kind. And this is a chart that looks at peak oil. So who's familiar with the term peak oil? No? 3 people? Okay, good. So peak oil is the concept, if you think of conventional oil, it's the concept that at some point, because conventional oil is a finite resource, at some point our ability to be able to extract it starts to decline. Not like we've run out of it, it's just that it gets harder to get to, you know, it's deeper or more expensive and so on, so our ability to extract declines. And this is a set of studies that were done about 15 years ago now that looked at forecasts around peak oil, and you can see almost all of them roll over at this period of 2010 to 15. And these were all industry studies, government studies. I mean, in Europe and the US, Department of Commerce here was developing strategies around peak oil, which were, you know, about how do we drive down consumption and so on. US foreign policy was all very aligned to access to conventional oil resources and so on, right? Who remembers Drill Baby Drill? Okay, what that was about was it was a political rally at this point when the forecast was that the US could be facing significant conventional oil shortages, and Drill Baby Drill was about saying let's get access to areas in protected zones, right? So that was basically the forward-looking forecast, and then something happened. Shale oil, right? So shale oil's always been there, and it was considered to be unavailable, tightly held. But people knew those resources were there. And fracking, a piece of technology that allows horizontal drilling, explosion, extraction of gas and oil, just suddenly changed the equation. These are the shale oil plays in the US. So the US actually is covered by massive deposits, or not covered, underneath there are massive deposits of shale oil. In fact, if you go to Pennsylvania, it's layer upon layer. And these are like massive pools of oil that are locked into the shale rock. So what happened in 2007, there's almost no production of shale oil, and then it starts to go exponential. And you know now, if you fly over or you hear about, or, you know, it's a boom through, you know, western North Dakota and all through the big fields. And that's led to this tightening of supply and demand in the US. So demand's been declining because of largely fuel efficiency standards, but supply has been increasing as the shale oil comes into the market. Total game changer. The whole US foreign policy, the whole consideration about energy outlooks, all of that just radically pivoted based on a piece of technology. Okay, let's talk about renewable energy. Remember, this is about thinking about how do we supply the world with this extra 50% energy demand that people are talking about. Renewable energies, these are cost price curves. So these are cost of production cents per kilowatt hour, 1980 to 2025, wind, solar and so on. And technology has been driving the cost of renewable energy production down on those exponential slopes. What happens when it flattens out? That's optimal time to invest. And you drive from here to Des Moines and you'll see the result. Okay? So we have suddenly all these renewable energies converging on optimal price points. Solar's the one right behind it, you know, and then there'll be others, forms that come. We know cumulative wind capacity globally. We know the solar, the blueprint, you know, the cost of energy declining on a logarithmic scale. Okay, so energy. So we seem to have got that one sorted out. Let's talk about water. So 450 million people, 29 countries now face severe water shortage. I know we don't think about that here so much, right? But 500 million people on the planet do. As much as 2/3 of the world's population could be water stressed by 2025. Half the world's rivers and lakes are seriously polluted. Irrigation uses 70% of the world's fresh water, and the forecasts is that the lack of fresh water, not the lack of arable land, will be the chief constraint to food production. The Midwest, the upper Midwest, has 20% of the global freshwater reserves.
And nobody else is getting any of it.
Well, let's think about a few things, right? Do you think the value of that water is built into the products that are produced? Not yet, I would argue. That water is largely unpolluted as well. So you have a small portion of the global population sitting on 20% of the global freshwater resources, which is a commodity that we know there's going to be increasing demand, and they were already talking about 2/3 of the world being water stressed by 2025. And I would argue that water and water resources have not yet been really factored in their importance at a macro scale. Let's talk about food, right? So this is a map of world hunger. So these dark colours here, this is where there's very high incidence of or prevalence of hunger, 35% and over, 25 to 34% and so on. You can see that the world hunger occurs predominantly through the African zone and parts of India, China and Asia. That, by the way, is also where the global population increase is occurring. Okay, so this is world hunger today, right? Or last year. So we already have lots of hungry people, and we're going to now have those hungry people in the location where the fastest growing populations are occurring. Now let's talk about the impact of climate change. The thing we don't talk enough about in climate change, because it gets all twisted up in that sort of weird political sort of narrative, what we don't talk enough about is that there are winners and losers. Okay, so this is the modelling that was the Nobel Peace Prize group that did the modelling. The reds down here, the reds and oranges, is where there's forecast for crop yield decline, 25% plus. The greens, dark greens, is where there's crop yield increases are forecast 25% plus. So the winners, the northern mid-latitudes, run right through guess where. The losers, all these areas where we already have hungry people and where population growth is going to expand. The fisheries will solve that. Well, unfortunately no, because the forecast, the impacts of climate change on fisheries is the yields will continue to go down in the tropical zones and they'll continue to increase in the high latitudes, particularly in the northern hemisphere. Now let's look at the biomass production capability in this part of the world. So this is a map that's published each year by the National Renewable Energy Laboratories. It looks at biomass production on a county level. So the reds and the blues are the highest in thousands of tonnes per year. And this stuff down here, this is mostly irrigated agriculture in California. That's going to have its own issues, for sure, right? Look at this. You know, people talk about this being the breadbasket of the world. How significant do you think that productive zone is going to be in a global context over the next 10, 20, 30 years?
Massive. How long will it last?
Well, you know, what's unique about this is the soils are 100 feet deep. They're some of the most productive soils in the world. But just draw some dots together here, right? You have a stable population. You have a society that has the ability to be able to translate technology into commercial application better than anywhere else in the world. You have 20% of the world's freshwater water resources up in this area. You have this innate ability, which is probably going to only get better under climate change scenarios. What does that mean for B.E.E.R? What does that mean for the metropolis of Minneapolis-St. Paul? Because I would argue that the significance of Minneapolis-St. Paul as at the epicenter of this is yet to be fully realised. But there's no accident if you look at the big agri-food companies that are located here and you look at how they're positioning themselves, they know that there's a growing disconnect between where food will be able to be grown and where it's going to need to be consumed. You know, so even with the Edina Chamber of Commerce and where we're doing some of the planning there, this concept of biosciences, biotechnology comes up for very good reason. So, energy, water, climate change, food. Challenge with a finite resource base, unique Midwest resource combination. I think it should trifecta, personally. You know, I work in a lot of places in the world. I can't say this. But you go, you've got the ability to produce food, you've got this abundance of fresh water, and you've got proximity to energy resources. What else would you want? from a point of view of a forward-looking economy, plus the ability to be able to apply technology and invent technology. So we have this incredible resource combination, but there is the potential for unexpected trends. You know, just like fracking completely tipped conventional oil upside down. You know, people are now, for example, in South Australia, which is about as close to the desert as you're going to get, right? They are desalinating seawater with solar energy and growing intensive agriculture in glasshouses. My forecast is what you will see in that arc of innovation, the peri-urban space around this metropolis, you're going to see increasing intensity in controlled agricultural production. And I'm talking animal proteins, I'm talking about, you know, plant-based proteins, plants, vegetables in 24/7, year-round production facilities. Why? Because you've got a whole bunch of converging trends. You've got water and all those things. Global disconnect between where food can be grown, where it will be consumed. What does that mean for collaboration here? So just as we go through this, sort of think about these different layers. You know, so think, for example, you know, where your organisations are located. So what ring you're in. You're sort of in a ring, sort of suburban. You know, is what happens in that economy out there of relevance to you? Or what part do you want to play in that? But if you think about mass urbanising society, then where does innovation occur? You know, maybe there is a place here for, in the locations you are, to be at the centre of some of these new sciences, and, you know, because I would argue that probably what's going to happen in food, if you just take the food, water, energy component, this logistic issue of moving food from where it's going to be grown to where it's going to be consumed, it's going to change the nature of food. You know, just like they take the water out of milk and they transfer milk powder and reconstitute it, I think what we'll start to see is some of these large sort of grain-based things. We may see food be deconstructed to be more like at a nutrient level and transferred and recombined. Okay, and it's not possible yet, but we're looking into the future. So when might some of that technology be possible? What does that mean for you, right? So let's turn to technology in the next industrial revolution. So the last part of what I want to talk about. Technology is a catalyst for change. If we look at history, we know change occurs exponentially. Last 100 years, technological change, massive impacts on our lives, right? We know that, right? There's not really a portion of our lives that's not impacted. But the next 100 years of progress, because it's exponential, is going to feel more like 20,000 years of progress at today's rate. So it gets unimaginable very quickly. But do you notice how a lot of that stuff that was like science fiction is kind of like here now all of a sudden? So that's just the first piece of it. So I want to give you a bit of a taste of how we think technology is going to play out. So we're clearly in what's called the next industrial revolution or technological revolution, right? So we had the industrial revolution, the age of the steam and the railways, steel, electricity, heavy engineering, oil, automobiles, mass production, information, telecommunications. The US did really well on a lot of those, right? The next big revolution is around artificial intelligence, robotics, and genetics, genomics, right? So let's just talk a bit about this. So at the level of a simple thing that's happening, so additive manufacturing, which is a key kind of component of the next industrial revolution. So we're all seeing this sort of stuff, you know. We print, you know, shot tumblers on the bar, or, you know, little widgets or something, right? But the real beauty of that technology is it allows the ability to be able to make incredibly complex parts that we were never able to make before. So in all high performance equipment, the issue is you've got to get heat away from, you know, what's generating the power source or whatever it is, right? And so additive manufacturing, 3D printing, is allowing people to be able to design parts in total with sort of corridors and conduits and things like never before, and basically every layer of molecules as that is built up can have different properties. So it makes industrial things possible that were never possible before. Who's heard of digital factories or digital twins? Okay, so manufacturing has been bumping along at about, you know, a couple of % productivity gains for about a decade, and, you know, 1 or 2% sort of cost reductions over a decade. But the digitization of manufacturing has caused this rapid transformation, where they're now talking about 20% gains in productivity and 15% cost reductions simultaneously. Basically, it's all about digital twins. So a digital twin is where you have a piece of real equipment and you have a digital replica of it, and you run all your predictive diagnostics on that, and you can calculate when parts are going to break down and do all that kind of stuff, right? And so it allows people to be able to fine-tune operations and automate operations in a way they never could before. Also allows for, at the level of additive, it allows for complexity and speed of prototyping. Now we think of robots like this, probably because we've got that sort of 1950s headset on. But robots today are a lot more like this, which is nimble, cheap, efficient, self-learning. What's the impact of this? Well, here's an example I use, this is from Western Australia. So we have very large iron ore mines in the middle of the desert, 1,500 kilometres away from any real population. The stated intention of those mining companies is to go person-free, so nobody on site. So they now have some of the largest trains in the world with no drivers. They have rock crushers, haul trucks, and they're all being operated from control centres in the capital city. How soon before agriculture goes fully autonomous? Or how soon before the long-haul truck fleet in the US goes fully autonomous? Because they're putting in dedicated lanes for autonomous trucks on autobahns in Europe this year. They're running autonomous public transit systems in Scotland this year. They're being trialled in Texas this year. How long before, in this next industrial revolution, does our whole vehicle fleet become autonomous, and what does that mean? And what does that mean for B.E.E.R? What does that mean for how you collaborate? What does that mean for what you need to be thinking about? Let's look at genomics. So this is about speed of change, right? So the cost of sequencing a human genome in 2001, it was $100 million. By 2021, it's going to be closer to $1. And this is the forecast on Moore's law. So the cost is dropping faster than even the prediction of Moore's law. So what happens when that cost of sequencing a human genome goes from $100 million to $1 in the space of 20 years? And I can show you chart after chart, which this is the underpinning type of speed of change that's reshaping renewable energies, digital twins, manufacturing, and so on. And my point in this is, we've been meeting for 10 years or something, you said in the introduction, right? and we were designed really as a 1950s organisation. Question for me is, how quickly do we become irrelevant, or how quickly do we need to adjust and adapt? Okay, and what do we need to be dealing with? So what makes this industrial revolution different? Machine learning, artificial intelligence, converging technologies, exponential impacts. Let me talk about this, right? Because I think this is the bit that will get a little trippy, right? Because we haven't seen it happen yet, I don't think, on large scale, but it's going to. So we know that what's enabling a lot of things is the industrial Internet of Things. So this connectivity between devices and being able to build communication. So what happens when all of this new technology comes together? And I would argue it hasn't yet. I would argue that what we're still dealing with is down this left-hand side here, and this is an adaptation from Industry 4.0, and I'll put an agricultural overlay on it because we're in the Midwest. Is that cause for alarm? Okay, so down the side here we have all these exponential technologies, biotech, neurotech, nanotech, 3D food printing, artificial intelligence, robotics, drones, and so on. Every one of these is fascinating, right? There's a whole world, right? And they're all exponential, right? They're all moving at this phenomenal pace, and there's all this energy and excitement around them. What happens when they come together, right? And so this is trying to picture this out at the level of a system. And I'm going to talk about this at the level of agriculture because that's what I'm interested in. You should think about it at the level of your cities. Okay? So let's talk about some things. So Watson, so why is Watson there? Well, Watson's the IBM programmable supercomputer. It's the issue in food is, for food scientists, is taste and flavour. So if you can manipulate people's reaction to food and it gives them that pleasurable sense, then it's going to be able to allow you to be able to produce all sorts of food types from different ingredients that create certain pleasurable experiences for the consumer. 3D food printing. People go, well, that's never going to happen. That's, science fiction, right? Or it's just going to be mush, right? But they'll sort that out, right? They'll get the texture right. But then what happens, right? So where's 3D food printing going to come to play? Like, where would it even be relevant? Well, think of a hospital, okay? We have some big hospitals here. You have thousands of patients, all with some unique ailment, all some recovery pattern, some medication that needs to be taken and so on. And imagine if you could customise everybody's meal in a completely unique way and give them exactly what they needed. And also at the same time fix all the other issues they've got. If there's obesity issues or there's undernutrition, you just fix all that at the same time. Think of high schools, right? We have all these spawn clustered there together, but they're all got different metabolic rates, different stages of their life, different genders, all these type of things, right? Imagine if you could, again, just highly customise those. Synthetic foods. Think about the issue of being able to manufacture foods. So one of the things at the value of changing societal values, so we laugh at the blow on her face and she'll follow you anywhere. I'll tell you one of the tipping points I see that's going to catch people by surprise is the shift away from animal-based proteins. That's a whole other story, right? But if you want to look at the leading indicator, look at what millennial females are purchasing. Why is it that supermarkets have gone to have significant vegan, vegetarian options in their choice and array? And then so imagine then you can produce a food and it's going to look like and taste like a steak. It's going to replicate that experience for you, but it's going to be plant-based proteins, and you're presented with two choices. One's been chopped off a cow and one's is a plant-based product. Moral and ethical issues aside, what happens to animal protein industries when that choice becomes indistinguishable? And that'll be probably within 10 plus years. Vertical farming, slingshot purification, robotic food processing, drone delivery, autonomous tractors. When all that comes together, we're starting to deal with a completely different version of agriculture. And then the question is, where do you think your economies here locally fit into this story? If you're in the middle of probably what I would argue one of the most, if not the most significant food producing regions in the world, where does beer fit into this? Are we concerned about retail, which we know is going through all sorts of disruptions? Or is there a positioning opportunity to be at the very heart of the development and thinking about these type of industries and their application? All right, so the technology of the next industrial revolution, impacting every corner of our lives, capacity to radically disrupt systems, changes in where things and how things will be made, new materials, new products. What do you think that means for collaboration with your organisations? All right, so I know that was a little bit of a breakfast journey into the future, right? So remember we said we were going to explore the future, ask some of the hard questions, think creatively. Hopefully that gives you an opportunity, at least from our experience, and you can draw your own conclusions quite obviously from the data points of what we're seeing. I would make this final kind of comment, two comments, right? And as I said earlier, one of them is, I believe this part of the US is just phenomenally well positioned. And not even at the level, we didn't really even get into all the societal things and so on, but just at the level of the fundamental macro drivers, I think that there's extraordinary potential. You can draw your conclusion, but that's my view. I think you have the trifecta, right? And if you've got the trifecta, then what are you going to do with it becomes the question. And maybe it's time to be thinking, because when I look at that map of biomass production, I look at that huge big kind of productive capability, I don't hear that the way that Minneapolis relates to that area. It's sort of like we're in this rural-urban binary equation rather than, no, this is actually a series of radiating rings of influence where different types of innovation can occur, and it becomes a mutually interesting collaboration to how do we capitalise on certain things. And so the sort of question I just want to leave you with is sort of what levels and types of collaboration will be required to succeed in this future. I think organisationally and quite obviously, we've designed things from the 1950s moving forward, But I'm sort of posing the question, if we think about this epic transformation that's occurring across so many fronts for humanity, if we were to design something for the future, what would that look like? Okay, what would your economic development, what would your collaboration look like? How would you be doing that differently? Who would you collaborate with, and so on? And my final comment is that I think that if you look at the speed of change that's coming, or that we're actually in the midst of, is what we know about waves of change is you're going to be on one of two sides. So you're going to be on the side, you catch that wave, right? And you take that enthusiasm and that vitality and that momentum and you ride that, get propelled by that, or you could slip off the back end. And the danger is when things move faster, that wave moves through quicker as well. Now, I think you're uniquely positioned, at the macro level in terms of, a metropolis and so on. The question is, where do you guys want to play in that picture as a group of economic development organisations, right? So I hope that was of some interest and value, right? So I thank you very much for the opportunity, and I want to hand it back to Kim.
Honestly, this was the most enlightening conversation and presentation I've seen in years. And so thank you very much. Thank you so much to the folks that we collaborate with right here in this room. I really enjoy the fact that we bring together Bloomington, Edina, Eden Prairie, and Richfield 4 times a year. But we talk and text more than people know as presidents of these organizations, and we really are always looking for ways that we can be a great resource for all of you. Bloomington, and many of you in this room know that we are in a very unique position. So not only are we collaborating with the suburban chambers right here in this room, we are also an affiliate of the Minneapolis Regional Chamber, and that happened 18 years ago. And that was out of survival mode for both of those organizations, and we have come together to become a very regional, important player, both in the inner metro core, as well as here, right here in our suburban area. So lots of great things to come, and many of your businesses, you are in the same position. You are not only headquartered here, perhaps you have locations all around the metropolitan area, and or you do business with people, not only right here in your community. And so this is just giving us so much to think about. My head is spinning, but in a good way. So I do want to just remind you all that I'm Kim Hansen with the Bloomington Chamber, and I want to thank our sponsors here today. We really do appreciate their involvement, and we hope that you have a chance to meet with all of them. AT&T, Promotional Select, and Insperity, which I think we really knocked out of the park. Lori, fantastic job today. Thank you so much for bringing in David. You all have a wonderful, warm Wednesday.